Hello and welcome to the Renaissance English History Podcast, Tudor Minute, your mostly daily dose of all things related to medieval and Renaissance England. So, I'm feeling spooky today. And I'm going to talk about witches. Actually, I'm working on a podcast with another podcaster, the History Bitches podcast. We're doing a joint podcast on witches and also on ghosts. So we just did our first episode on ghosts today, Tudor ghosts, and we're working on a witchcraft one that we're going to record tomorrow. So I'm thinking a lot about witches. So I want to talk about this one particular witch. And I have to say, I'm using witches in like air quotes, witches, because witchcraft is a really interesting thing for me. So I'm just going to talk about like the background of witchcraft. And then maybe tomorrow I'll talk about the witch that I want to talk about today. Because if I did it all at once, we'd be here forever. So, witchcraft. It's really interesting that throughout European history, there have always been like wise women in communities. And these are women who maybe are healers, maybe know how to make their own potions for illnesses, and know how to work with herbs. And this is very common. And it wasn't really until the bubonic plague, the Black Death, when a third of the population of England died, that people started really seeing witches as this kind of force of evil. Before, if you were one of these kind of special women who had these special gifts, you could be good or bad. But it wasn't until the Black Death when really they started taking on this aura of real fright, and people started, being really upset with them. And then it wasn't until the printing press, really, until the Renaissance, that people started actually doing like witch hunts. And in England, interestingly, it never got as bad as it did in France and in Ireland and some other places, especially during the Tudor years. Once you move on to James, it starts to heat up, just like in the U.S. in the American colonies. That's when the Salem witch trials would have happened. But in Tudor England, there wasn't a whole lot of witchcraft hunts. There was an act in 1562 to abolish witchcraft, and normally, though, it wasn't punished by the church, it was punished by the state for acts of treason or for murder. So in general, Elizabeth, it seems, didn't have a problem with like healing women. But the whole idea of witchcraft is very interesting because the kinds of women who would be accused of being witches, to start with, the first thing is people would accuse women of being witches, or men, but the vast majority, 95% were women. People would accuse women of being witches when things happened that they didn't understand. So it wasn't really until the Enlightenment when people started seeing scientific reasons for crops failing and for floods and things like that, that people started realizing, okay, it wasn't the hand of God or the hand of Satan. And so when things happened like the Black Death or like a drought or bad harvests, people would think, oh, it had to have been something supernatural. Maybe we upset God. Maybe God's upset with us. Maybe it was a witch. And so when there wasn't another explanation for things, and a lot of times things happen that there just aren't explanations for unless you can look for the science behind it, people would say, okay, well, we need to blame it on somebody. And so usually the people who are the most vulnerable for this would be a particular kind of woman who was most likely to be branded as a witch or to be harassed as a witch. And that would be a woman who was generally old and unprotected. So a woman who was either a widow or had never been married, didn't have the support and protection of her family around her. And also a woman who generally would have animals. And, if you think about it, it's like the stereotypical single woman with 8 million cats, like a Bridget Jones kind of thing. If you never got married or if you're widowed, it's not unusual that you're going to have animals around to be your friends. Animals are great friends. Animals are actually sometimes better friends than humans. Yeah, so it wouldn't be unusual for a woman who wasn't married to have animals around her. And if this woman was poor and was ostracized from the community and didn't have their protection, it would be even riskier for her. And this is the kind of woman that people would generally keep to herself, and people would say, oh, that's a witch. And I find it very interesting because I've always been somebody who's kind of quirky and does my own thing. And even, when I was very young, that was just my shtick. And you couldn't really do that in the pre-modern age community was so important, and fitting into community. That's a large reason why people didn't travel. It wasn't because they couldn't go places. You could walk places, but it was because you weren't known, and being known was so important. Having your reputation and having this community around you who knew you, who you grew up with, they grew up with you, was such an important part of life when you had so many threats from external threats and internal, with sickness, with droughts. You wanted to have this community that, like, you guys were thick. Like, if your crops failed, they were going to help you. There wasn't crop insurance. There wasn't any kind of insurance for things, fire insurance or anything that we have now like that. So these things would be devastating to people. And you needed to know that you had the support of this community around you that was going to stick with you. And if you couldn't fit into that community, you were at real risk of losing your livelihood or even your life if something happened and you didn't have the protection. And for a woman who was maybe kind of quirky doing her own thing, that really didn't fly for people back then. And it was not if you were ugly as well, if you had some kind of physical deformity as well, you were really at risk for being branded a witch once people started to become really afraid of witches. And a lot of that also, interestingly, comes from the printing press. So it wasn't until the printing press when a lot of biblical tracts and things like that started coming around that people also started to become much more aware of witches. So that's really the context behind witchcraft in Europe. The 6.5 minute version. There's lots of books. You could read books too. But the 6.5 minute version on the context behind witchcraft in Europe in the 15th century and 16th century was what I just said. So tomorrow I'm going to talk about one of the witches that I discovered, Mother Shipton, and she was born in a cave. So stay tuned for that. To learn more about the Renaissance English History Podcast, you can go to http://www.englandcast.com. That's ENGLANDCAST.com. Or you can go to facebook.com/englandcast. Thanks so much for watching. I will talk to you again soon. Bye.